Welcome to On the Line. I'm Christine Williams, coming up for discussion on our Viewpoints Hour. 3 Muslim Canadians tortured in a Syrian prison, now going after the Canadian government. Calgary and Waterloo, Ontario, looking at bringing in living wages about 70% more than a minimum wage. Stay tuned. And these are the issues we're presenting today to our Viewpoints guests for commentary. The 3 Muslim Canadian men tortured in Syrian jail but going after the Canadian government and wanting an apology. Calgary and Waterloo, Ontario, looking at bringing in what's called living wages, about 70% more than minimum wage. And the critics of sentencing circles based on restorative justice are accusing the Aboriginal tradition of being too lenient on criminals. Now let's meet our Viewpoints guests. Paul McKeever is leader of the Freedom Party of Ontario, and Raheel Raza is a journalist and an author. And you, the viewer, as always, you're our third guest. We love to hear from you. Feel free to call in at any time with any of your comments. Now, the first issue that we're talking about today, take a look at it up on your screen. It's entitled, Blame the Torturers. You may have seen it, but what we're looking at here in this particular story is 3 Muslim Canadian men. They were in the area of Afghanistan, detained, put into a jail there, and tortured. They came back, and the writer of this particular article that we see here is Tariq Fatah. He is one of the founders of the Muslim Canadian Congress, and he's a little bit up in arms, accusing the Canadian media of perhaps being kind with these fellows, putting them up as, or the poor Muslim men who went abroad were somehow detained. In fact, it was looked into to see whether the Canadian government was in any way involved, and it was determined by the justice that there was absolutely no direct involved in the information that was put forth leading to their being detained and put into the jail. But somehow they were. And Tariq had a few things to say about it. We're going to hear from Tariq very shortly. I'm going to start with our guest sitting here, because do you really think that Canada owes these 3 an apology? First of all, the premise of what Tariq has been saying is, why do they want an apology out of Ottawa? How come they're not blaming the torturers in the first place? If you can just keep it brief for now, because I want to hear from Tariq as well, who wrote this article. I'm going to start with you on this one, Paul. Your opinion on this.
I can't know their motivations or intentions specifically. However, when someone asks someone to apologize for that which they have not done, I can only conclude that they're hoping to make that person admit to something, to make that person look bad, to defame themselves, and to thereby give them a bad reputation, self-inflicted.
Mm-hmm. Now, Justice Iacobucci, there was a little bit of, I don't want to say it was sort of a fuzzy issue here. He said there was no direct involvement from the Canadian government or any officials involved in the matter of fact, leading to their arrest overseas. But indirect involvement? It's a little bit hazy at this point. You wrote about it yourself, Raheel, and I'd like to hear what your feedback is.
Yes, I did, because I think there are a lot of questions that were unanswered, and even in the 544-page report by Justice Iacobucci, sorry, I can't always pronounce that correctly, he said we don't know the whole story. And, like to the south of the border, where you have Joe the plumber who needs the whole story, I think that Canadians also need the whole story, because a lot of questions have been unanswered. We know directly that torture is a terrible thing, but we know that this torture wasn't done by Canada. It was, in this case, Syria.
It was also reminiscent of Arar.
Exactly. So the question is that, why is it that Canada owes the apology anytime any Canadian suffers outside of Canada? Shouldn't those countries who are actually perpetuating the torture be held for responsible? Shouldn't they be lobbying and demonstrations in front of the Syrian, embassy? But where are the Muslim communities who are supporting these people in terms of what has been done by the country outside of Canada? Canada already has a reputation abroad of being wishy-washy by being saying that if you step on our toes, we'll say sorry. But there's a fine line between wishy-washy and being and looking at this in terms of being totally naive.
Yes. Well, we happen to have Tarek Fatah waiting on the line now. He's there, and he was the one that wrote this article. And the article, once again, is entitled Blame the Torturers. And we want to hear from him. What does he think? Tarek, are you there?
Afternoon.
Thanks for joining me, Tarek.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. And yourself?
Okay, one day at a time.
That's for sure. Now, Tarek, you wrote some very interesting information in this article. Starting off, you were saying that the Canadian media hasn't quite treated this case the way it should be, presenting these three men, in fact, as heroes, the poor things, suffering under an Arab jail, brutalities. You talk in this article about yourself, that you, in fact, have faced torture in the past. But the biggest question you ask is, why isn't anybody asking the question, how come these people are targeting us, the Canadian government, and not their own torturers? And I want your comment on that.
Well, I think there's precedent over here. Nobody seems willing to annoy or stand up to or investigate into the real issues involved over here. We know that these three, or two of them at least, went to Afghanistan. A year after the Russians had retreated from that place, there's not a single journalist who is asking the question, well, what were you doing over there? And they were on the side of terrorists like Hikmat Yar. The other guy was with Ahmad Said Khidr, who was a known terrorist. His son is now in Guantanamo Bay. And the journalists have been basically interviewing them and reporting back. I haven't heard or read in any of the papers where someone has asked Al-Mati or Al-Malki, well, what made you go there? Because I need to know that. This is besides the fact that our country or our taxpayers are not involved in the adventures of these men or in the torture. So they need to be put under a microscope, and they're getting away with it. And it seems that the precedent set by Maher Arar, there is some glint in their eyes that we too could get an apology and some compensation. And what we're saying is that as long as there are some Muslims who know what it is to be under the knife of the Hikmat Yar Taliban and the Mujahideen, we are not going to keep quiet about this.
Tarek, embedded in what you're saying, there's evidently a certain force in this country, certain types of people that are perhaps taking advantage of us, our naivety. Can you comment on that?
Well, it's not their fault. It's the fault of the people who are willing to be duped. In fact, patriotism itself has become a four-letter word. Anyone who expresses solidarity with Canada's values is seen as a right-wing, redneck sort of a person, and we are seeing evidence of that every day. It is so disturbing that there isn't any institution in this country that would inform or educate new immigrants as to why Canada is a 400-year success story. What made our institutions, what is the basis of our separation of religion and state, and what the chartering classes are doing is that they are quite willing to let new immigrants be in their ghettos so they can be exploited during elections or nomination meetings. And that is why I feel that this country is never going to have an Obama amongst us. Where this is a question being asked, by the way, in Europe as well. Where is Germany's Obama? Where is France's Obama? My point is that you don't get people like that unless you ask them to assimilate and uphold the values of the host society.
Tarek, in our society, is there a fear underlying, you would say, officials and the general public when it comes to dealing with the Muslim groups?
There's a certain amount of white guilt among the mainstream community. Nobody wishes to be labeled by the accusation of being racist, so people are scared. They don't wish to be depicted in a negative way. And the Islamists know very well that this is the weakness of the chartering classes, and they use it. I mean, I was just reading today that, the Islamists are right now involved in almost every newspaper of this country. One organization, which is an unindicted co-conspirator in a terrorist trial in Texas, is holding media training class in Toronto with one of the Toronto's leading newspaper reporters.
Wow.
And they are even advertising it. And I doubt if the editors of these newspapers would ever allow the mainstream reporters to be involved in political groups. But if you're Muslim, you can do it.
Wow. Tarek, I want to thank you for joining us. You've certainly given us a lot of food for thought, and you've put forth a lot of information that we're going to continue discussing. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
You see,
Wow.
I want to pick up on something that
Yes.
Tariq just mentioned in passing, coming back to the three gentlemen who claimed that they are asking for an apology because they were tortured as Canadian citizens. And this ties into what Tariq said, that, you know, when they call themselves Canadian citizens, what are the criteria that makes them Canadian citizens? What have they contributed to
point.
Canada? Where is their loyalty to Canada? I mean, as two of them are Syrians, one of them is Iraqi. You know, last time I heard there wasn't a Taliban-style theme park in Afghanistan. So what were they doing there? You know, if my sons wanted to go visit, that question would be asked.
Raheel, you brought up a very good point that I think we need to continue discussing. And for you watching, we want to hear from you as well. What do you think it takes to be a Canadian? What does that mean? Have we lost sight of that? Let us know your opinions. We're going to go for a break. We'll return after this. Stay tuned. Hello again, and welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line. We're continuing to talk about our first subject matter. Take a look at it again. It's entitled Blame the Torturers. Very interesting piece written by Tariq Fatah. And this article is stating, you may be aware that the three Arab men were in Syrian jails. They were tortured, blaming the Canadian government of, I don't know what, asking for an apology. But you see, it brings us all back to what happened with Arar. And we have this tendency in Canada, according to what Tarek was saying, to be very quick to apologize for everything, all those poor men being tortured. We don't ask questions. And you were alluding to that, Raheel. I'd like to discuss more with the two of you, but I know we have a couple of people waiting on the phone lines, and we'd love to hear from you as well. So let's go to you, Jacob, on line 4. Hello, Jacob. You're on the line.
Oh, hi there. Yes, I like to say that all these problems are stemming from the 9/11 attacks that we had. But the problem is that there is still many unanswered questions about who knew about it, who actually did it, and the United States and Canada is not promoting a new 9/11 investigation when we know that the FBI also admitted it, that Osama, there was no link that Osama was behind it. The FBI admitted it. And we know for a fact that there was lots of Israeli involvement and pre-knowledge of...
We don't know any such thing for a fact, but I'm glad you called in, Jacob. Yes, there are all kinds of theories about 9/11, but we're faced with a problem right now in our own country, such as this. Tarek pointed out that there were links with these men, at least 2 of them, with jihadis. I'm talking wicked jihadis. If you read this article, and once again it's entitled Blame the Torturers by Tarek Fatah, he talked about this jihadist group that at least one of these men were affiliated to. They were going so far as, if you happen to be a woman not wearing a burqa, they'll throw acid in your face or take their prisoners and literally skin them alive. That's the kind of affiliations we're looking at here. But what we have tended to do is say, oh, the poor guys that were tortured, we ask no questions.
Well, one of them fought with Hikmat Yar, and the other one was affiliated with Qadar's father, the senior Qadar, who we know has had links to Al-Qaeda. So this is nothing to do with 9/11. You know, before 9/11,
there's a war on terror after 9/11. We know this.
That's a different situation.
But it's a different situation.
But this is a battle that's taking place within the Muslim world. We're talking about Muslims versus Islamists, the politicization of Islam, the radicalization of Islam, in which many people are being sucked in.
Yes.
And we know that is happening. But to be involved in something like this, and these are 2 separate issues, as I said, torture is terrible. So let's talk about the country that tortured them. Let's target the country that tortured them. Why should Canada be the one always to give an apology and then offer compensation and go into complete hysterical sympathy? Mm-hmm. Isn't this what always happens?
Yes.
You see, if my native country is Pakistan. If I go to Pakistan and involve myself in the politics there, which can be quite dirty, I don't come back and ask Canada to compensate me or apologize for what may have happened there. You see, so we have to understand where our loyalties are. We have to understand that citizenship is not just a green passport. It entitles us to some responsibilities towards this country.
Is it fair enough to put it this way? When people choose, these men, once again, Tarek talked in his article about them having direct affiliations with terrorist groups. But is it also fair to say for citizens, the average citizen, that if they decided to travel to Pakistan, to Afghanistan, and these countries, when something happens there, don't blame the Canadian government. They made that choice. Is it fair to say that?
It is very fair.
You think so? Paul, your opinion on this?
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that Tarek brought up, and that's been brought up at this table, is this idea of, what does it mean to be Canadian, or what does Canada stand for? I think
Big question.
Yeah, and I think it's a very important question. I think he's right to say we don't do enough to inform people when they choose to live here and to become Canadian, to explain what it is that it means to be Canadian. To some degree, every immigrant sort of knows. They're leaving a country that they like less. They're seeking to get away from something and to come toward an opportunity, a hope. And I think what makes Canada Canada is that you can leave behind those parts of the old world that ought to be gone. The intolerance, whether it be religious or whether it be secular, the lack of respect for every individual's life, liberty, and property. Mm-hmm. And that dividing line that Canada has traditionally put between personal, religious beliefs and etc., and the governance of a free country where everyone's accepted, provided they don't get violent with one another and they live together in harmony. That's what we want. That's what we see on the streets of Toronto, at the airport, a worldwide, a world-class country, not one that says it has to be this way.
Now, given what Paul just said, Raheel, you travel a lot. Would you say that internationally, Canada is seen as the easy scapegoat by certain groups?
Well, yes.
The easy walkover?
Absolutely. Absolutely, it is. I mean, that is the reputation that Canada has outside, and I have been writing and speaking about this for the last 2 decades to say that, straighten up. I mean, we have to now follow the example of what's happened across to the south of us and, shape up our policies as well and get stronger within. What is happening is that this doesn't strengthen us internally. It weakens us when there are so many people who want a piece of Canada. And Canada is not just about coming here for the advantages of the health care and all the wonderful thing this country gives us.
The arrow goes both ways.
It does. There has to be something that we give in return. And if nothing else physically, we can give our loyalty.
Certainly. Let's go now to Pima on line 5. Hello, Pima. You're on the line.
Hi. My comment is that why should Canada apologize for the torture that they got from Syria or elsewhere in the Arab world? And my another comment is that some politicians in the Liberal, they are supporting these people to get the vote bank from the Muslim. John Crescent did to Carter family.
Pima, thanks for calling in. Feedback on this?
Yes, he's absolutely right.
Yes.
I mean, it is not entirely the fault of the people who are using the system. They're using the system because they see the loophole and they see the weakness in many of our elected officials who, for the sake of votes, will compromise their values as Canadians as well. So, I mean, it is a combination of ignorance and lack of information and questions being asked, straightforward questions. It's covered up by media, and it's our officials, government officials in Canada, who are totally turning a blind eye to some of the most atrocious happenings right under their very nose.
Now I have a question for both of you, and it's going to be after the break. Do you have a concern about the direction that we're taking in Canada and those that are exploiting us, frankly, and the kindness of our country? We're going to go for a break. Once again, we want to hear from you, so give us a call. We'll be back to you after the break. Stay tuned. Hello again, and welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line. We're continuing to talk about our first story, which deals highly with Canada's identity. Those who may take advantage of it, whatnot, but the two of you said some very interesting points. And I'm going to get back to the two of you shortly, but I want to hear what our viewers have to say. So let's go now to Sabri on line 4. Hello, you're on the line.
Hello there.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I have a question for Mrs. Raheel Raza. The question is that when Maher Arar was taken from Montreal by RCMP, when we have our own system for interrogation in Canada, and we highly believe in our system, even though we have a system, when he came after his vacation from Syria back to Montreal, why was he picked up from Montreal and sent back to Syria when we have our own system to interrogate on Maher Arar? Well, even though the RCMP knew there was something going on Arar, the reason why they picked him up from Montreal.
Sabri, I understand what you're asking, and I'm going to let Raheel address that one directly, but I'd like to know what your opinion is on these particular 3 that were in a Syrian jail, captured from the Afghanistan area. What's your opinion on these 3?
I think there is some sort of a link. I believe that RCMP was following him, and there was some sort of a link. That's the main
You believe the RCMP was involved. Okay.
Yeah.
Raheel, I'd like you to address this.
Well,
this is what we hear.
Yes, the RCMP is not perfect, and there are many loopholes in the way that they're doing their work, and that is one of the reasons why we have these situations happening, is because the system, the institutions, the people who are working are not doing their work. One, there is a great deal of ignorance about the happenings of the larger Muslim world. Secondly, this idea, this knee-jerk reaction, as I said, of this hysterical sympathy, this idea that they'll be called racist if they accuse someone of being involved in nefarious activities that are against Canada and
the guilt
and the guilt. Nobody ever talks about that.
No,
I mean, it's a very straightforward thing. You're either loyal to this country or you're not. So very often the RCMP bungles. We've seen this happen in case after case after case. But still, this does not apply to these 3 gentlemen.
No, it does not.
With these 3 gentlemen, there are certainly some questions that need to be asked. Now, we know that they haven't been accused of any criminal acts in Canada, and that is very clear. But asking questions is an entirely different thing. Why isn't media that normally rushes to this sort of thing or asking those very blatant questions? I mean, we are asking those questions. As Muslims, we are asking those questions. So obviously the questions are there in the minds of Canadians. So let's have discussion and debate about it. This is the first time we are discussing it.
Yes.
Well, there's a tendency, especially in some streams of the media, to bash all things Western. And sometimes that just may amount to, who cares why someone's complaining about our government? If it makes them look bad, let's give them a platform. And so there's a lack of discrimination between what's actual news and what's just somebody shooting their mouth off, because more and more we see anybody who's willing to
comes down to what sells as well.
Yeah, but anybody who's willing to say, Harper's like Bush, or the Canadian government is not sensitive, or Canada's a Western thug or something, they're actually putting these people front and center in our newspapers and making it seem as though what they have to say is actually legitimate, when instead what the newspapers ought to be doing is saying, it's Canada that made newspapers possible. It's the freedom of the press. And the governments ought to be saying not, oh, we're sorry, I apologize, but we're quite proud of the West, and we're quite proud of the fact that these 3 gentlemen are in Canada, and they're not being sent to prison on trumped-up charges that we'd have nothing to charge them with, for example.
Well, we're seeing constant erosions of who we are, and that's the big question. Do we even know who we are? What direction are we going in? And that was a question I would like the 2 of you to answer.
Well, then also, added to this is this question of fear. Freedoms. Where are our freedoms when people run to human rights as soon as you criticize them? So we've got a huge issue of, how much freedom do we have to criticize those things that are happening in front of us? So
absolutely.
Where are we headed? Any predictions from the 2 of you? Are we going to come to our senses, do you think? I'm talking as joint Canadians. Are we going to come to our senses?
It seems as though the trend is that things are going to get a whole lot worse before they even have a chance of getting better.
Is that your prediction?
We are down a very slippery slope, and unless we wake up and smell the coffee, as they say in Canada, we are headed for a lot of trouble.
Okay, let's go now to Halimo on line 6. Hello, Halimo, you're on the line.
Oh, yeah, thank you for letting me talk. And I just a call to mention the word that you say always, the media saying burqa and the small stuff that people talk about. But the Iraq war was, they didn't have a right to go in Iraq in attacking, and they didn't listen American first. It was Bush war. And then Canada went and helped.
Halimo, you're calling in to talk about the Iraq war. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about these 3 men that were taken to a Syrian jail, tortured, and now they're blaming the Canadian government. And according to Justice Jacobucci, he said, okay, this was determined in the Supreme Court, that there was no direct involvement on behalf of any Canadian official, yet the guys who were tortured don't have any accusation against the Syrians or the Egyptians for how they were tortured. They're accusing the Canadian government for some reason and wanting an apology. Do you have anything to say about that?
Canadian, I have nothing to say about that. Canada, I'm only saying that when they talk about the burqa that you mentioned personally, that's why I was calling.
What did you mention? I mentioned, okay, this is the context. I mentioned the burqa. We were talking about these 3 men and their affiliations to, 2 of them in particular, to jihad organizations overseas. Now, according to Tariq Fatah, he talked about one of those organizations that was one of the worst of its kind, and the only context I mentioned the burqa was what Tariq said about that organization overseas, and that for women who weren't wearing a burqa, they would throw acid in their face. Is that what you're referring to, Halimo?
That's why I say we always only take the easy thing, you know, the burqa. It means nothing. Thousands of people dying everywhere in the world. So, you know, we just need to respect human life and human history, you know.
Which they're certainly not doing when you look at these kinds of terrorist organizations. Thanks for calling in, Halimo. Let's go now to Rohan on line 5. Hello, Rohan, you're on the line.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, wow, you have patience. I applaud you. But still, you know what I mean, I think this topic is just going all over the place. I mean, even in respect to all the terrorism that's going on and the reasons why the Canadian government went in, I mean, I think Canada needs to stand firm as a country. You know, I've been in Canada since the early 70s, and you know what I mean, I've watched certain things, not necessarily gotten involved with them on a level. You know, lady that I'm looking at right now, you've mentioned, you know, on certain levels of social, economic, you know, political, you know, also the man that wrote the book, he spoke about the communities, the ghettos. You know, he made some valid points in terms of, you know, those people being taken advantage of. And I'll tell you, I've lived in those ghettos too. You know, there is so much violence that happens within this world, and violence exists within our country, within our province, within our town of Toronto. You know, I'm proud for this town. I'm proud of Canada. You know, I almost went to Canada as an athlete, and I'll tell you, because of my color, I did not go. Okay, I could get into all of that another time, but even still, you know, we have a wonderful country which we all need to be proud of. Proud, very proud. You know, there's places in this world violent.
No, to go for a break, Rohan. Thanks for calling in. We'll be back after this. Stay tuned. Hello again. Welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line. We're going to go on to topic number 2 very shortly, but let's first go to Wahid on line 4. Hello, Wahid. You're on the line.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
Good. My thing is, I don't think they were requesting apologies for the Syrian torture, but they were requesting apology for the Canadian institution involvements that they might have instigated a little bit worse. And the other thing was the justice who investigated it. I'm sure he investigated all their involvement in Afghanistan and everywhere that we would have known by now.
Okay. Comments about this?
Well, I believe that the investigation, when it was made, found that Canada did not have that much of an involvement in terms of its institutions, and the report was exactly this situation. They are the ones who identified that they had been in Afghanistan, and they didn't ask those kinds of questions. So the apology that they are asking for is for being tortured in Syria. They are not asking for the apology for the institutions. They're asking for an apology for the torture that they underwent as Canadian citizens.
What I found kind of strange is you didn't see any sort of a venom at all toward the Syrians,
well,
the jails.
Yes, in a situation like this, you think that the diplomatic ties might be broken, or you think that they would be asking questions of the Syrian ambassador, or there would be some sort of demonstration outside the Syrian and Egyptian embassies by, if no one else, at least the Muslim groups who are supporting these 3 men. But nothing.
But as Tarek said, blame the torturers.
Yes.
And we're going to move on to topic number 2 now. Very interesting, because I don't know how many of you have heard about this. Take a look at the headline, Killer Living Wages. Now, the fellow who's writing for the Financial Post here, Peter Taylor, he's calling it Killer Living Wages because it's actually called Living Wages. Now, for those of you who don't know what that is, the phenomenon started in 1994 in Baltimore, and it went something like this. Minimum wage just doesn't cut it. It doesn't allow you to make a decent living, hence they put the word living wage in. But the thing is, it was intended for the poorest cities in the States. To date, according to this article, there are about 140 American cities that has adopted this particular value of living wages, but the concern that the writer has in this particular article is it seems to be spreading outside the very poor cities. And now, believe it or not, it's trickled its way into Canada because of all cities, Calgary and Waterloo, Ontario, they're now looking at the possibility. In fact, right there in Calgary, the city council is going to be meeting to discuss it, January or February. Waterloo looking at the same thing, bringing this in here. Now this is odd because we have laws when it comes to minimum wage, and the money that they're looking at is bringing this thing up to $13 and some cents. If you calculate it, it's more like 70% more than minimum wage, brought in by municipalities. Have the two of you ever heard of such thing before this particular article was raised?
Well, I mean, it's just the flavor of the day and the more extreme one, isn't it? I mean, this is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. The taxpayer, the local taxpayer is going to be paying this, and the 3 towns that are mentioned in the article, Waterloo and Calgary and et cetera, within Canada, were actually above average towns as far as what people are earning. This is a blatant attempt to do a few things, not only to redistribute wealth, but to prevent towns from outsourcing to private companies services that then could be done by unions instead. It's unions trying to protect their jobs, not just to protect them, but to actually get a little bit wealthier. And the persons getting ripped off in this whole deal are every one of us, all of the taxpayers. It's not right. The city, government is being used as a cover for what is no different than a theft. And I would encourage any of those union guys to just come to my door, bring a gun, put my head up against the wall, say, give me some of your money, instead of electing someone to do it for them, which is exactly what they're doing.
Now, the big question to you, the viewer, would you like to see your city opt for that phenomena called living wages and bring it in? Now, it's kind of ticklish how this is being handled because according to the article, municipalities don't have the power to legislate across the board. So what they're doing is, if you happen to be a contractor and you're working at all with the municipalities, or even if you're getting any kind of a subsidy from the municipalities, you're going to be subject to this living wage. So what it amounts to is, if you happen to be working in these areas, you're basically shut out because then the municipalities may not really find it feasible to contract your services anymore under this kind of a wage. So how do you feel about it? On the other end of the stick, if you're making minimum wage, maybe you're happy to see that wage go up to a living wage. Let us know how you feel. And Raheel, how do you welcome
be the devil's advocate here?
You're going to welcome it.
Yes, I am. Because I think, the cost of living has, there's something called COLA, which is the cost of living allowance. So either the cost of living allowance for people should go up. 20 years ago when we came here, the minimum wage was $6. And look at how our cost of living has gone up. So I think for the person, depending on the city that they're living in, it's different in different cities. So I think that it's a great idea because, people need to get a higher cost of minimum wage and a higher cost of living. But, it does have some downsides. I mean, I won't say it's totally acceptable because the guy who's earning $14 an hour, which is just a few cents above the minimum cost of living in some cases, may not feel comfortable about this.
Now, I'm glad you brought up different cities, because if you happen to be living in BC, it was calculated in Vancouver, that living wage was calculated at $16.74, and that's based on the parents, both of them, and 2 children. It'll be $16.74, but if you happen to be a single mom, it's more than that.
Right.
And you may wonder, well, how did they come up with these numbers in the first place? Well, it's based on the Statistics Canada low income cutoff. That's what it's being calculated on. Michael, I want to hear what you think about that, though. Do you agree with it? Because I have a concern of how this was brought in. I'd like to hear what the two of you think. For instance, any government facing a possible election is quite careful when it comes to raising minimum wage, which we know there have been repeated calls for through the ages. This is a quite neat way to just kind of sneak it in the back door, leave it in the hands of municipalities to bring this in. And the way it's being brought in, somebody has to pay for it. Do you have concerns of how it's being introduced in society?
It's not a question of how, for me, it's a question of whether. I don't know why they stop at the tax stage. We know that the people who are achieving these higher incomes, not the lower ones, the higher ones are people who are more talented, they have more to offer society, they can sell products and services that are worth more than the guy who's making minimum wage. So why don't we do this? If we want to expose this for what it's worth, why don't we just force little Jimmy to give his A to Sally, who had a C, and average it out. So everybody gets a B, and no matter how hard Jimmy works for his A, he'll always end up with a B, or maybe even worse. Let's give to each according to his need. Give Sally the A, give Jimmy, who earned his A C. And let's see where that leads society. Let's see how hard people work. Let's see how hard they work to get ahead when they know that it's going to be stolen out of their pocket and given to people who didn't earn it.
Wow. Before we go for a break, let's go now to you, Andy, on line 1. Hello, Andy. You're on the line.
Yeah, I just changed my whole direction. I mean, I am totally appalled by the so-called Freedom Party man saying that, to take from A to give to C and make us all Bs. That is totally atrocious. I mean, I am totally disgusted. Anyways, the reason why I called in is, I live in a garden home, a condo garden home, and we have a lot of, people who are working at minimum wage, all right? And I mean, I've seen, even, some of the, some of the guys here, they lace their boots, with the whippersnipper cords, because they can't afford the cords. And I've even given them coats a couple of times.
And you're happy to see this come in? You'd like to see this come in?
Absolutely, and it's got to be across the board federal.
We're going to go for a break. We'll be back after this to discuss it. Stay tuned.
thought I was serious.
Hello again, and welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line. We're talking about, well, it's not quite the minimum wage issue. It's more the living wage issue, which many of you may be hearing about for the first time. I have to admit, I hadn't heard about it before. And I'm going to have to give you a chance to respond to Andy here, okay? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, first of all, Andy, I hope you know that I was being facetious there. I'm suggesting that it would be absolutely morally criminal to take away someone's grade A and give them a C and give the C earner an A. I think that's abominable. And what I'm saying is that when you take someone's money that they've earned with that A because they earned themselves a great position, a great job, and you take the benefit of having earned that A and you give it to someone else who ultimately was the person who, you know, got the C and didn't get a good job, you're doing the exact same thing as though you had taken away an A and just said, look, we're just going to treat everybody the same no matter how hard they work, no matter how much or how little they achieve. And I think that's completely and utterly soul-destroying. It punishes achievement. It punishes merit. It punishes hard work. We have to be a society that values achievement rather than saying, well, that all comes secondary. First, we're just going to relieve suffering. No, first comes advancing ahead, pursuing happiness. That's what makes a society great.
But it's hard to pursue happiness if you are starving. So I would veer on the other side and say that, you know, it's not such a bad idea to have some form of equal distribution of wealth. This is very little.
What form, though? We all differ when it comes to where to put that line. I mean, there's a drive today that we see when it comes to this whole redistribution of wealth, and it's drifting into the socialism. And I'm not saying communism. Some people seem to think that once you talk socialism, you're talking communism. Not necessarily. However, it's one step closer.
Well, I'm not speaking from a political perspective. I'm speaking purely from a faith perspective. You know, that's where I come from. I mean, I just think that there are issues, great issues of poverty and equal justice, you know, social economic injustice in many countries, including Canada, where there are, I mean, there's absolutely no reason for people not to have a roof over their heads or starve. And, you know, you can turn around and say that they have to work. But this is, you know, when we don't take out the issue of merit, and I appreciate what you're saying, but then there are also the differences of people, for example, who just have basic cost of living, which is got, you know, you have to pay a rent or you have to pay a mortgage, which may be different in different cities of Canada. So, you know, if your minimum wage can come up to affordable housing, then we've got something to talk about. And I think that, you know, instead of sneaking it in through the back door, it's something, again, that should be open to public debate and discussion, and then we might look at ways of bringing it into the system.
I think there's a difference between and you drew the line between policy and government, and on the other hand, the issue of ethics. Certainly it is the case that if you have money that you can part with to help your fellow man, a person who's deserving, I have no problem with that. You should.
It's your conscience,
right.
So you should do it.
But when that choice to do what's right the choice to help out your fellow man, giving him the benefit of the doubt that he's not a scoundrel, is replaced with a gun when the government does it for him. It's no different morally than for him literally just to come to you and say, give me your money or I'm going to beat you up. It's exactly the same morally, and it's just as morally abominable. We shouldn't go there.
We're going to have to continue this conversation. We'll go for a break very shortly, but I want to hear what you have to say, Gord, on line 4 first. Hello, Gord. You're on the line.
Hello?
Go ahead, Gord.
Yes, I'm listening to this conversation. I'm thinking, there's a time for everything, like we get stuck into ideologies, like right and left. But like this time for everything, like for American comparison, like a time for a Reagan, a time for an FDR. And I think sometimes you get stuck in an ideology. It's almost like a religion. And you got to think of, like, sometimes as government, you have to, spend to stimulate the economy. And other times the taxes are too high and you have to cut them. So there's a time for everything instead of getting stuck.
Is it time for living wages, Gord?
Well, you have to discuss it. I mean, you have to make sure you look at both sides. I think people need living wages, definitely. They need to, work. If they're going to work hard, they need to be rewarded. But at the same time, you can't, you have to see how much of that is a burden to other people as well.
Where do you draw that line? Good point, Gord. We're going to go for a break. We'll continue discussing it after this. Stay tuned. Yes. Oh boy, 3.5, not even 4. Okay, thank you. Hello again, welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line. We're not going to have time to go to our last topic today, but we're on a very interesting one now, and it's about the whole issue of fair wages, living wages. I mean, these municipalities bringing this in, people don't have a choice, they're bringing it in. But my question to you was this. Here's a concern of mine, and I'd like the two of you to respond to it. When you have no expectations of people, period, I'm talking across the board, whether you're rich, poor, middle class, it doesn't matter. You could be brought up with a lot of horrible circumstances, with abuse, you belong to gangs, whatever it is. But you don't have any expectations of people. They tend to sit back, get comfortable. You tend to put on them, oh, poor you, you don't do anything, I'll take care of you. There's no incentive to do anything. And I'm concerned that that's the kind of an ideology or kind of a spirit we're bringing into this country. You don't do good? Fine, no accountability, we'll take care of you. But somebody has to work hard to pay for it. There are those in legitimate need. They suffer with disabilities, genuine, debilitating ones. There's got to be some kind of a system in place to take care of these people. But we seem to be bringing in a kind of an ideology that I'm concerned about. I'd like the two of you to respond to that. I'll start with you on this one, Paul.
I'm concerned about it myself, and we're seeing it worldwide, but in particular in North America. all of the politicians, both presidential candidates were big into bailing out banks, taking money from people who earn it, giving it to bankers who had made bad investment decisions. It was absolutely wrong. It's a transfer of wealth. I don't think the government has to come to the rescue of the economy. The government needs to back out of the economy, and when Mother Nature of the economy
Let it learn
says...
from its mistakes?
Absolutely.
Raheel?
I agree with you. You know, this apathy is something to be concerned about. But on the other hand, I think we are heading into some sort of a dark area which needs a lot more investigation and research and discussion, especially in Canada.
We heard it from Gord. He says we need to discuss this more.
Yes, we need to discuss this more. And, you know, while we can't expect policies to be pushed upon us by the government because all they do is backfire. I mean, look at multiculturalism. You know, it's not something that needs to be forced on people because it then, you know, has totally the opposite effect. But on the other hand, you know, we do need to discuss about poverty and about social assistance. I mean, this is a country that has a great network, but at the same time, when there are still issues, they need to be brought out into the open. And, you know, we need to talk about ways that it can be alleviated. I mean, if I'm eating 3 meals a day, I want to ensure that my neighbor also has 3 meals a day. And I think that apart from the ethical responsibility, we need to also have a joint Canadian responsibility to take care of these needs of each other.
Not easy to balance, though. Final words on that at all, Paul?
Oh, I put the balance at making sure that at all times the flow of goods and services is completely free of any form of coercion. And that is the way you make sure that you have a civil society, one that everybody wants to come to, one that they're escaping to.
Slippery slope. We'll see where we land on many fronts. Thank you both so much for joining me. That's all the time we have for today. See you again next time. I'm Christine Williams, and from all of us, thank you for watching.